We'd like to begin by acknowledging that this program is being presented from the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, Tulalip, Snohomish, Suquamish, and Duwamish, as well as other Puget Sound Native people who have stewarded these lands for generations. The opening pictures showed some of the people and places our presenter will discuss. Sno-King School Retirees is a local unit of the Washington State School Retirees Association. It is an organization of retired and active educators from the Edmonds, North Shore, and Shoreline school districts. We are delighted to be able to bring you this program with the support of and assistance of Humanities Washington and their Speakers Bureau. Humanities Washington is a nonprofit organization dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking. It provides programs like ours today and many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. Thanks to the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Washington Secretary of State, the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service at Washington State University, presentations like you are about to enjoy are shared in all corners of our state. Our presenter today is David Burge. Burge is a historian, teacher, and writer who has been researching the early history of the city of Seattle since the mid-1970s. He has published 14 books of history and biography. Burge's latest book, Chief Seattle and the Town That Took His Name, is the first biography of Chief Seattle intended for adults. David M. Burge, a biographer and historian to the Duwamish tribe, Chief Seattle's mother's people, spent more than 20 years exploring Chief Seattle from a variety of sources to reveal a leader of epic character. While he is speaking, if you have a question, please use the Q&A section to write your question. Now, let's hear from David and learn what he discovered about Chief Seattle. David?
Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. What I want to do today is focus on why I wrote this book, because I believe Seattle to be a great man. The city of Seattle is the largest city in the world named after a Native American, and that in itself is a significant aspect of the city. Seattle was born sometime in the 1780s, and he died on June 7th, 1866. And when he died, his passing made no news at all. There were 2 territorial newspapers in Seattle, and there were several in the Puget Sound district, and not one mentioned him. He simply was not news at that point, which is an ironic thing to consider, even in a town named after him. They didn't even bother to mention his death. There's a number of reasons. There are a number of reasons for that, mostly having to do with the fact that most people didn't care, and also because there was a certain embarrassment involved in having a city named after an Indian. Many of the early settlers, who actually chose the name, were often asked, why would you name it after an Indian? That was considered disrespectful to whites, to name it after a wild Indian. They had their own reasons, but nevertheless, the fact that Seattle was actually quoted in his lifetime by in the morning edition of the New York Herald in February 28th, 1856, and that in 1870, a long article appeared in the Overland Monthly in San Francisco about Seattle's death, finally began to shake up the settlers, because people began to ask, well, who was this guy? Why would you name a city after a Native American? What did he do that you named it after him? And that was a question that they tried to answer. These are the earliest pioneers, the Denny's, the Borans, the Bells, and those. And so what they did in 1890 was they erected a tombstone over his grave on the west side of Puget Sound, not in downtown Seattle or any place in Seattle. They erected a marble tombstone over his grave, and on it they wrote this: Seattle, chief of the Suquamish and allied tribes, died June 7th, 1866, a firm friend of the whites, and for him the city of Seattle was named by its founders. Baptismal name, Noah Self, aged probably 80 years. There are all sorts of inaccuracies in that, but nevertheless, they thought that was sufficient to answer the questions. And of course, it simply inspired more questions. And so I want to go from his very early life and show just what kind of a man Seattle was, that Midwesterners from Illinois would name their town after a native chief they encountered on the other side of the continent, because it was no accident. In any case, the tombstone gives us some interesting information. It says that he was about 80 years old. That would put his death in the 1780s. And this was a time of absolute apocalypse for Native people. The maritime fur trade had been going on since the 1870s, and ships from China, British, French, Spanish, American ships were coming to the Northwest to trade trinkets and beads for sea otter skins that they sold in China for as many as 50 silver dollars apiece. So they were making a fortune. They also brought in disease, and these diseases eliminated probably 90% of the population, the native population. It was an absolute apocalypse. And as a result, native societies crashed. The class structure that had basically held the societies together, it was eliminated. And a lot of ambitious people who would not normally have been brought into leadership circles were, because of their ability. And Seattle appears to have been one of these. There was a debate over whether he was a noble of noble birth or whether he was actually the son of a slave. In his own lifetime, that was a very real issue. And in 1854, an American official, E.A. Starling, wrote to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs back in Washington, D.C., that were it not for Seattle's good sense, this slight on his name would cause him a great deal of trouble. But Seattle was not an ordinary person. He was an extraordinary person. And he managed to provide leadership despite this. What's interesting to me, and not a little funny, is that in the 1850s, this debate over whether he was a slave or noble was still going on in the Native community. And a man named George Adams, who was a noble Snoquamish Indian from Shelton, who was a member of the Washington State Legislature, had no use for Chief Seattle, and used to basically disparage him by saying, well, he was just a son of a slave from Fleetown. The place where Seattle grew up, which was a village called Chutapaltuabsh, was called Flea's House, and it had a myth associated with it. But so the name was right, but to this, we really don't know to what extent one of his grandmothers was captured as a slave, carried off to the north and ransomed, but often when you were brought back from being captured, you were still considered somehow tainted, and that taint stayed with Seattle and his family for the rest of their lives. It's not surprising then that that the path Seattle chose for his life was that as a war leader. I'm assuming that some of the bellicosity that was noted for his temper, he could be a very violently angry man at times, came from constantly having to counter these slurs cast upon his name. He became a war leader, and more importantly, a successful war leader, as early as 1810, when he was probably 20 or so years old, when a number of raiders came down the White River and Duwamish River to attack Elliott Bay at night. Now, with the disease decimating so many groups, and the societies crashing, there was a strong effort to try to rebuild populations. And how some groups did this, the more powerful and populous groups in the north, was they would go on slaving expeditions. And Seattle and the Puget Sound area was ripe for this, and they would attack a village at night, kill as many of the men as it could to prevent blood feuds, and then capture the women and children and bring them back home with them to either employ them as slaves or sell them as slaves. There was a lucrative slave trade going on the Northwest coast at this time. When Seattle was a small child, such a raid was carried out at Salmon Bay, north of the city of Seattle, which destroyed the village of Salmon Bay. And the Shilshalabs, we get the name Shilshol Bay from the area named Shilshol Bay from that village. And a row of severed heads was left on the beach in front of the destroyed village as a calling card. This was intolerable. And so a number of local leaders gathered together and debated, what can we do to prevent this? And one of their number, a man named Kitsap, which we call Kitsap, who was a nobleman at Suquamish and a war leader, said, well, individually we cannot defeat these people, but if we join together and form an alliance, we might be able to strike back, and strike back in their own home waters, not wait for them to come to us, but to go and attack and hopefully prevent these raids from taking place. Eventually, by 1825, Kitsap had formed such an alliance, and one of the artifacts of this was he would invite leaders from groups as far away as the Chehalis River and as far north as the Snohomish River, and they would meet together at Suquamish on the west side of Puget Sound in a building, and he invited the groups to build an apartment on the building so they would have a place to stay during these meetings. And gradually the building grew. So it was nearly 600 feet long. This is called Old Man House. It was one of the largest wooden structures in North America at the time. And it was a key element in the formation of this alliance. In 1825, the alliance was ready, and it headed north in an armada of 200 canoes for Vancouver Island. And Chief Seattle, well, he wasn't chief yet, but Seattle was a warrior in this group. They arrived at a village on the south of Vancouver Island coast, attacked it thinking it was the Cowichan. These were the people who were carrying out these raids, and killed many men and began to round up the women and children as slaves, paying tit for tat, and also to plunder the camas garden that the village had, at which point the chief of this village said to the leadership, well, you know, we're not the people you think we are. The very people you've come to attack are going to be attacking you shortly, because they're on the way to attack the S'Klallam people on the north shore of the Olympic Peninsula. He didn't use those names, of course, but anyway, they're on their way here, and so you may want to rethink what you're doing at this point to us, and you might want to release us. But the Puget Sound groups had thought nothing of that. They continued on. They loaded up all the slaves and plunder in their canoes and were going to head back to home. And all of a sudden, there indeed, the Cowichans came in hundreds of canoes around the corner on the way to raid the S'Klallam people. And both groups stared at one another. What are we going to do? This is a total surprise for both. And eventually, Kitsap roused his battle ardor and they attacked. And it was a total disaster for the Puget Sound group. Very few survived. But and Kitsap and a number of other people managed to make it back. But as some say as few as 20 survived, some say as few as 6, but it was a tactical disaster. But it was a strategic victory because the Cowichans were so stunned that a people they typically raided to get slaves and suffered no consequences from that had the wherewithal to not only mount an attack, but to actually carry it out. Create a large armada of canoes for this purpose. And so these, even though they were defeated, these were a people to be considered. And apparently it was a tradition amongst Native people on Puget Sound and elsewhere at this time, when if you had a powerful group coming in, repopulating an area that had been depopulated by disease or just raiding for slaves, you could fight them, and you might have to fight them several times, or you could intermarry with them. And then the etiquette of kinship would mitigate the violence. And so this is what the Puget Sound people and the Cowichans did. They agreed to stop raiding and to intermarry. This was a lesson, and this worked. Seattle, every fall, was said to have gone to the Fraser River to fish for salmon. He could not have done this unless there had been an agreement between the Cowichan people, which were already moving up on the Fraser River. In any case, this lesson stayed with Seattle, and the alliance held for perhaps a generation. Seattle continued his role as a raider. In the 1820s, he carried out a raid on the S'Klallam people on Vancouver Island. In the 1830s, he was up on the Snoqualmie River raiding. And he even, there's a story about Seattle raiding on the Snoqualmie River in which the Yakima are chasing him down the upper Snoqualmie in their canoes, and he is fleeing in his canoe, and he gets to the brink of Snoqualmie Falls, at which point he leaps from the canoe to a rock at the brink of the falls. To this day, it's still called Seattle Rock. His canoe goes over the side, and before the Yakima realize what's happening, being unaware, being Yakima, that there's a falls there, they also go over the falls and are killed. Now, nobody knows how Seattle got off the rock. That's not part of the story. And whether it's factual or not is, of course, up in the air. But nevertheless, it's an indication of just how Seattle was regarded as a war leader. He always surprised his enemies, and he did so successfully. And when he attacked, the attack was murderous and complete. In 1841, he attacked a camp on the White River, killing many people and abducting many slaves. He and his half-brother Curly were involved in this particular raid. And in 1845, he carried out the greatest raid of his career, which was on the White River in the town of Auburn and Kent are today. And in this case, most of the people, I got the wrong one. In 1845, he carried out a raid on on the Chemicum, where Port Townsend is today, and wiped out the tribe. This was a tribe, as I say, located where the Admiralty Inlet met Puget Sound, and they had been a problem for many people. They spoke a totally different language than everybody else. And they had once been quite influential, but they had been reduced down to one village. And so the S'Klallam wanted them dealt with permanently. And so he asked Seattle if he would join, if his Suquamish and Duwamish people would join. And he promised his oldest son, his daughter, a marriage to his daughter, if he would. Well, Seattle agreed. And the attack took place, and it was bloodily successful. Virtually the entire community was destroyed. It was a genocidal conflict. And it ended with Seattle's greatest victory, but it also ended in the death of his son. And that moved Seattle very much. 1845 was also the year that the Americans began to move into Puget Sound. And I'm sorry, there's somebody at my door, but they've gone now. And they began from the Oregon Territory. Now, the Americans had been coming in since 1805, when Lewis and Clark showed up at the mouth of the Columbia. After them, the Astorians, the fur trading, the Pacific Fur Company came in, founded Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia in 1811. Then the mountain men began to move into the Mountain West and to trade for furs there. In the 1830s, missionaries began to show up in Washington and American settlers, and gradually an American community developed in the Willamette Valley. By 1845, however, they were already crossing the Columbia north into the Puget Sound region. That was the first American settlement in what is now Washington State. The Americans caused a great deal of alarm amongst Native people. Initially, there was friendship, but gradually the violence that the Americans brought with them and their insatiable hunger for land overcame any residue of hopefulness by Native people. And they increasingly regarded them as a threat, especially in 1847, after war broke out, after the Cayuse Indians had killed a number of missionaries at the Waiilat on the Walla Walla River. And the Oregon Territorial Volunteers were organized. I should say that by this time, 1846, Great Britain and the United States had partitioned Oregon at the 49th parallel. So the southern part became the United States territory, the Oregon country, and the northern half became what is now Canada and British Columbia. In any case, the Cayuse War was a thunderclap, and it soured Indian-white relationships thereafter. And actually thereafter was almost constant conflict until 1890 at the massacred Wounded Knee when the last Indian resistance was crushed. In any case, as I say, the Indians were very worried about the Americans. And one of these native leaders was a man from the Snoqualmie River Valley. His name was Pat Kennan. He was a war leader amongst the Snoqualmie. And in 1848, he called a great council on Whidbey Island, in which probably several thousand Native people attended, in which a debate was held. What do we do with these Americans? And it was agreed that before their numbers even became greater than they already were, they needed to be wiped out or driven out. And in the process, let's knock off the Hudson's Bay Company too, because then we can get the fort and all the goods inside the fort, and we'll be rich. And so that was the general gist of the debate, but not everybody agreed. There was one man, Sno-King, who, as a headman at an Indian village at what is now Olympia, at the southern end of the Sound, who was already working with the Americans settling there, and who had actually signed a treaty with them in which the Americans, if the native people would cease certain customs like killing slaves at the deaths of their masters, the Americans would agree to defend them from their enemies since they had weapons to do it. So Sno-King, who's the whites called Grayhead, his native name Sno-King meant it all changed at once, and it meant that he had become prematurely gray as a young man. Grayhead stood up and said, you know, well, that's all well and good for you, but actually we've made an alliance with the Americans, and they promised to defend us from our raiders, which up till now have just been mostly you, Patkanum, and your Snoqualmies. And so I think we're happy keeping the Americans in our area, and we don't want them to be driven out. At which point Seattle, who seems to have supported Patkanum, arose and said to Grayhead, you don't have to worry, the Duwamish tribe will defend you against any people who want to raid you. And Patkanum held the council, even though it ended up in disarray. He showed up at Fort Nisqually 1 year later in 1849, in the summer of May 1st, 1849, with 100 armed men. Showed up at Fort Nisqually, which is in the southern part of Puget Sound. And the ostensible reason he was there, he said, was to negotiate with with a Nisqually headman, Lachalet, who was treating his wife badly. His wife happened to be one of Patkanum's daughters, another one of his daughters. And so Patkanum went into the fort to negotiate with Lachalet over this issue, while his men, 100 armed men, stayed outside. The fort door stayed open because to close the door would have been a sign of hostility, and the Hudson's Bay Company did not want to fight 100 armed Snoqualmie and Skykomish. In the fort, while this negotiation was going on, another Hudson's Bay Company employee, a man named a man named Gohom, was cleaning his musket, and it fired inadvertently. And the Snoqualmie outside the fort thought, oh my God, they have shot Patkanum. And so they rushed the fort to get into it, to seize the fort, and also to rescue their chief, Patkanum, if he needed rescuing. The Hudson's Bay Company staff barely managed to close the fort's gates before they entered, but 2 Americans were left outside, and both were killed. One of these was Wallace, a man named Wallace. So 2 Americans were killed, plus several Snoqualmie in the shootout that developed over this event. Patkanum managed to escape through another gate and join his people, and they exited north. They retreated north, and the Americans claimed that on his way out, Patkanum said he'd be back and he'd wipe them all out. So the Americans took this very seriously. They were paranoid of Native people anyway. They've been fighting for 300 years with Indians, and why should anything be different on the West Coast? And so they began to build blockhouses everywhere on Puget Sound, where they settled on the Puget Sound country. And to show the Indians that the Americans were serious, Joseph Lane, who was the governor of Oregon Territory, planned to arrest, if they could find out who shot the Americans, they would arrest them and hold a trial at Steilacoom Barracks, which was about 10 miles north of Fort Nisqually. This happened, and as a matter of fact, $2,500 that Congress had awarded, that had given to Oregon territorial officials to buy gifts for Indians, was used to hold this court proceedings. And I'm going to stop here now, that if you have any questions, we can move on. Well, make it quick.
Okay. Well, I mean, you told me to come, so.
Yeah, I understand, but I thought you'd be coming. Well, of course, you said between noon and 3. That's right, 1 and 3. Okay. What do you want me to sign?
Basically, it's the rental agreement, $199 a week. There's a 1 week minimum. First bill today. Last goes when you call us.
Okay. Right there. Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
And
Okay.
then your deposit includes your service charge.
Okay, and do I sign this?
Yep.
Okay,
I'll leave you a copy too.
great, okay,
And then sign here.
right.
Would you like an explanation on the chair or the mirror?
I think I can probably figure it out, but if I need to, I'll call.
Okay. Do you want me to leave the optional piece to wear glasses in the chair?
Ooh, yeah, that would be nice, thank
Okay,
you.
I'll show you.
Yeah.
So
Be great.
here's your copy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
David,
Yes, I'm here. Do you have any questions?
I have one question that's really not a question so much as could you please clarify the difference? Because we had a concern about the name Chief Seattle not
yeah.
really existing.
I'm going to do that in the second part, yes.
So the chair,
Yes.
the cushion that's on there is a full one.
Yeah,
But if you want to wear glasses, just pull it off,
Put
slide
that-
this one on.
sounds
Glasses
good.
slide into there.
Okay, thank you.
Do you need the periscope for watching TV?
I don't
Doesn't
watch
look like
TV.
you have a
I don't have a
TV.
TV.
Okay,
no, thank you.
all right.
Okay, ask the question, please.
Okay, so could you clarify the difference between self and
Yes.
Chief
Okay, very
Seattle
good.
and the
It's a
naming?
good time to do it. Okay, first of all, self is not his name because there's no TH in Hualjutsi, which is the Puget Sound native language. What there is
Glottal stop.
you pronounce his name, there's a glottal stop. Basically, you pronounce his names like this, Seattle, Seattle. And so during his lifetime, there was an article written about Seattle in the local papers and said that elderly man you see perambulating our streets is Chief Seattle, after which the town of Seattle was named. And his name is 3 syllables with the emphasis on the second syllables, Seattle. And so what you have is you have a sound, which is the first syllable is a C, and it ends with a glottal stop. A glottal stop is what you don't hear when you say the phrase uh-oh, and you've got that gap between the and the o. So it's C, and then comes the second syllable, C-ah, C-ah. And the second syllable ends with the real killer for English speakers, which is the voiceless lateral alveolar fricative, which you make by putting the tip of your tongue at the roof of your mouth and blowing out the right side. And so it is siach, siach. But apparently in his time, the last syllable was pronounced more sharply than it is now. So you have siach, siach. And Americans would hear that as Seattle. And so I chose Seattle because it's actually closer to the original pronunciation than self, which is a single syllable with a TH ending that never existed in Lushootseed. So that's how his name is actually pronounced. I tried this out when I gave a presentation at the Tulalip Tribal Cultural Center, and at the end, I said to one of the attendants, a native woman, I said, well, how did I do? And she said, well, not bad. So I took that as great praise. Anyway, are there any other questions?
None at the present time, David, so
Okay, barring any other
barring any others.
my house. Okay, so basically we have Pat Canham leading what may have been, the Americans were convinced it was a raid on Fort Nisqually. It was the beginning of a race war. The Hudson's Bay Company didn't think that. They thought, oh, just a row at the fort, an excuse to get more slaves. But in any case, it was unsuccessful. At the show trial at Stillicum Barracks, 4 of Pat Canham's brothers were arrested and brought in chains back to Stillicum Barracks to await trial. And the trial was held in October of 1849. And the full array of American jurisprudence was on display. There was a counsel for the defense, there was a prosecuting attorney, and they went through the same processes, and eventually 2 of his brothers were acquitted and 2 were condemned for murder and were hung the next day from an oak tree. So the Americans hoped that if the missionaries couldn't teach the native people to fear God, territorial officials would teach them to fear the Americans. It didn't quite work out that way, because within a month, an American soldier had already been killed in a revenge killing. But all the native people were required to assemble to watch the hanging. This was a major event, not just for the Americans, but for the native people too. And Seattle appears to have been in this crowd. Now, Seattle and Pat Canham never got along well during their lives. And so Angeline, Seattle's daughter, remembered that he said that, well, he thought the people who were hung deserved to get hung. I remember this is an old war leader who has killed many people. And I was going to mention the how he pronounced his name was typically, as a war leader, he struck terror in the hearts of those who encountered him. As a matter of fact, Emilius Needham said, now Seattle's power, native men were believed to be possessors of supernatural powers. That is to say, in their adolescence, they would go out, carry out a spirit vision in an isolated place, and make contact with a supernatural being who would then, if the power was agreeable, teach them the skill that they would need, give them the skill, gift it to them so that they would become great people, and teach them a song. And when you sang the song, the power would manifest itself. Today in Western culture, we still say people who have certain skills are gifted. And so that's a holdover from a time when we shared a similar belief. In any case, women also could access these powers. Seattle's power was said to be thunder, and we believe he received, I believe, he received his power in Lake Burien, whose name was also Thunder. But in any case, it made a man rich, it made him wealthy, and feared. And Emilius Needham, who was in the 1950s, I think I mentioned this, talked about him, said that Seattle's power was a great power. And part of this power was that it was symbolized by birds. These were thunderbirds, not the big, pterodactyls of legend, but smaller birds. The Swainson's thrush, actually, which flew up in gyres at the beginning of thunderstorms in fall and spring. In any case, Seattle had these two wooden birds, and they were rattles. They were hollow rattles. And during the winter dances, when the people would come from their year-long perambulations around the edge of the world to gather food and preserve it, they would come back to their winter village. Well, a lot had happened in the 9 months they had been out. And so to reestablish community within the household, a single household, they would hold the winter dances. And the winter dances were for people to demonstrate the powers that they had. Some of them had received these powers within that year. Children had been born, people had died, things had changed, and this was how you reestablish equilibrium within the social unit of the house. So what Seattle would do during these winter dances, he would shake his rattles and dance up the length of the house and back, singing his power song. And he had a powerful, booming voice. And as Emilius Needham said, when Seattle was mad, it was the person he was mad at who shook. It was a wonderful play on words. In any case, Seattle was very impressed by the wherewithal of the Americans to assemble this court and also the threat they represented. And so he had an extraordinary, he went through an extraordinary change of heart. He ceased being a war leader, at least in this instance, and he became an impresario. What he did was he moved probably 200 of his Duwamish people south from their village on Elliott Bay, villages along the Duwamish River in Elliott Bay. He moved them south to the brand new little frontier town of Olympia, which would become the territorial capital. And they settled on the beach adjacent to this incipient white settlement on Budd Inlet. And in any case, they built their houses there. There was a large wooden house, presumably for the chiefs. And what Seattle's intention was at this time was to invite Americans north to settle in his territory, where they would intermarry with his people and establish prosperity for both groups, where both groups could share their prosperity. This was a remarkable move on his part. It was, of course, modeled after what he had experienced in the wars that Kitsap had carried out with the Cowichans. So Seattle took this custom, and employed it in his new relationships with the Americans. Seattle was nothing if not single-minded. And so when he set his mind to a purpose, he devoted his whole self to the success of that purpose. And it paid off. That summer in 1850, a group of men, 3 men, Benjamin Franklin Shaw, Isaac Eby, and another man, Darius Kinsey, came north in a boat from Olympia, from Bud Inlet, and traveled north and took a right at Elliott Bay and landed at the community of Chichilalas, the little crossing place on the east side of Elliott Bay, where a festival was going on, a religious celebration in a large house that had been built especially as a ceremonial house. And they landed their boat. As soon as they did, people from within the house poured out, surrounded the boat, firing their guns in the air. Well, the Americans assumed they were all going to be killed. Then Seattle came out of the house, stepped on a log, and gave his first recorded speech. And I'm going to read that to you now. So you have to get these three Americans electrified by their reception. And Seattle steps out and he speaks through an interpreter. So he speaks in his native language. It's translated into Chinook jargon. And presumably either Chinook jargon or English it was given to these three visitors. And he said, "My name is Siash, and this great swarm of people that you see here are my people. They have come down here to celebrate the coming of the first run of good salmon. As the salmon are our chief food, we always rejoice to see them coming early and in abundance, for that ensures us a plentiful quantity of food for the coming winter. This is the reason our hearts are glad today. So you do not want to take this wild demonstration as warlike. It is meant in the nature of a salute, in imitation of the Hudson's Bay Company's salute to their chiefs when they arrive at Fort Victoria. I am glad to have you come to our country, for we Indians know but little, and you Boston and King George men, these are the Americans and the British, know how to do everything. We want your blankets, your guns, axes, clothing, and tobacco, and all of the things that you make. We need all these things that you make, as we do not know how to make them. And so you are welcome. We want to welcome you to our country to make flour, sugar, and other things that we can trade for. We wonder why the Boston men should wander so far away from their home and come among so many Indians. Why are you not afraid?" This was published about 50 years after its giving by Benjamin Franklin Shaw. And a question arises, well, is it really what Seattle said? And for the most part, I think it is, largely because there's evidence in it that Shaw could not have known about. For example, when Chief Seattle says, "This is given in imitation of the salute given by Native people in Fort Victoria when the Hudson's Bay Company chiefs arrived." Seattle was there when George Simpson, who was the governor of the Northern Department of the Hudson's Bay Company, visited that fort. And so Shaw could not have known this. But it's in the speech. Now, the ending where he says, "Why are you not afraid?" I suspect that's Shaw elaborating and doing his American thing, white speaking at the end. But in any case, that's the first speech we have of Seattle. And what it shows is that Seattle definitely wanted the Americans to be with his people, to settle among and intermarry with his people so that they could prosper together. This was a vision of a hybrid racial community. And it was about 100 years too early. The Americans simply weren't ready to do that. I should say some Americans weren't. Most Americans were. Many of the Americans, if this is in 1850, the California gold rush has been going on for 2 years. Most of the easily gathered gold had been taken up from stream beds and is replaced by hard rock mining. And a lot of American young men decided they didn't want that. But they were out west, they might as well see what it was like. And so they traveled throughout the West. Many of them came to Seattle to work in the new lumber industry. And when they did, they chose Indian women to marry and settle down and raise families. Many of these families still exist. Educated Americans who, most of these young men probably had received a primary education and were footloose and fancy free and didn't really care one way or the other. They wanted their needs and hopes to be satisfied, their desires satisfied, and so they were quite happy to intermarry with Native women. But other Americans, the more educated, ironically, believed that that was racial suicide. So they carried a very large and cumbersome basket of racial bigotry, intolerance with them, and condemned those white men who would marry Indian women as committing racial suicide, saying they were little more. They gave up all their virtues and just became wild like the Indians. And the young men didn't care, but this lesson, since history is written by often the educated, this was the lesson that is spoken of in the books. The Indians were not really good neighbors. Asa Mercer basically starts his effort to bring white women to the Northwest in the 1860s because, as he said, there were no other women for men to marry. Well, it was completely false. There were plenty of women for white men to marry. There were Indian women, and many white Americans were happy to marry with them. But to the educated, that was considered terrible. Even Teddy Roosevelt said it was racial suicide. So you have that situation in history where there is a right way to describe things having to do with white supremacy and a wrong way, which means you don't discuss it. And many of these things were not discussed. The fact that David Maynard had been married to a young Native woman, one of Chief Seattle's granddaughters, before he got divorced from his wife in Ohio and married Catherine Brochures in Oregon and came back to Seattle. The fact that Henry Yesler also had a Native wife, which he gave up when his wife joined him from Ohio. So this racial history is very rarely discussed in local, in what we would call regular white history. There are other things that are not discussed too. For example, why did they name the town Seattle? As they said, many people ask, why would you do that after naming it after a wild Indian? And the reason why they did, and that happened in the summer of 1852, was because the settlers owed their existence to Chief Seattle. Chief Seattle organized them, moved them across from West Seattle to the east side of Elliott Bay to his people's village, a Duwamish village, and the first name of Seattle was Duwamish. The story goes, well, it wasn't a great name, and so we decided to call it something else. And we decided on Seattle. And why? Because it sounded nice. Well, they couldn't even pronounce it. The closest they got was Seattle, which I think is close enough, but it didn't sound nice to them. It was odd and exotic and weird. As a matter of fact, an early travel writer wrote that when you crossed the Columbia, you were assaulted by these barbarous names for towns like Tacoma and Seattle. So no, it didn't sound nice. The reason why they did it was because Seattle was the person they depended on to survive. In 1851 and in 1852, the settlers landed in November 13th, 1851. That winter, they nearly starved to death. There was a famine, and it would have been fatal had not Seattle arranged with native people in his villages to supply the settlers with potatoes to get them through until a ship could come with a supply of flour. That happened again in the winter of 1852 and 53. When the settlers were confronted with the need to slaughter their animals that they had brought up from Oregon, for the winter, Seattle made sure that they understood that there was pasture, and it happened to be up in Salmon Bay, so they could take their cattle there and pasture them over the winter. And again, that was a great gift he did for the city. When many Indians showed up heavily armed and threatened to do mischief, usually amongst themselves, and then terrified the Americans, Seattle made sure that it didn't happen. He was absolutely essential, and that's what an impresario is a person who basically is responsible for the prosperity of a town, an old Spanish term describing a successful alcalde of a Spanish pueblo. In any case, Seattle was that figure, and so they they named the town after him, as it would make sense. There's a lot of interesting things that go unspoken or where history is changed. And not just the naming of the town, but the first church service that was held in the town. And it was said to have been held in Yesler's cook shack that is associated with his mill when Modeste Demers, who was now Archbishop of British Columbia, came north from the Catholic mission at Toledo in southwestern Washington on his way north to take up his duties as Archbishop of New Caledonia, which was the early name for British Columbia. And they stopped, Seattle was ferrying him north, and they stopped in Seattle to spend the night. And it was said that the first church service was held in Seattle on that time. And what happened, and it's true, what happened was he didn't celebrate a mass, but he did celebrate a prayer service and in Arthur and Marianne Denny's cabin. And the Denny children were there. They were assembled, as a lot of pioneers were. It was the first church service held in Seattle. And Elnora Denny remembered the theme of the sermon, which was charity, my friends, charity. Demers said, you know, you're building this community and you want to, you know, you need a community spirit. So you're being generous and open with your fellow Americans, but you need to include the native people if this community is to flourish. Something that Seattle would have told it. She remembered that. It made sense to her. But in histories, it doesn't happen in the cabin. It happens in Yesler's cook shack. The only problem with that is this was in August of 1852. Yesler didn't even show up until October. And so it couldn't have happened in his cook shack. But again, it was an embarrassment that Methodists and Baptists from Illinois would attend a Catholic mass led by an archbishop. That was simply impossible to imagine. And so they unimagined it. A lot of things like that happen in early historical accounts, and we should not be surprised by them. But nevertheless, Seattle was an indispensable part of the foundation of the city. You can actually attribute the foundation to him. This changed, of course, when Washington became a territory, when it separated from Oregon in March of 1853. And the first territorial governor, Isaac Stevens, arrived in the area at the head of the Railroad Survey, superintendent of Indian Affairs, first governor, head of the Democratic Party. He had all these galloping agendas, and he called meetings. And in January of 1855, he arrived in Seattle and gave a speech to the settlers in a large house which had been built on it was actually a brothel that had been built on the beach in Seattle. The village had already been named Seattle. And where he told them, now he was the head of the Railroad Survey. He had selected, or his engineers had selected Snoqualmie Pass as the pass over which the railroad would come, the Northern Pacific Railroad would come to reach Puget Sound. And he told the settlers, you know, soon you're going to hear the neigh of the iron horse in the valley of the Snoqualmie, and it's going to come down and it's going to make you a geometropolis equivalent to London or New York. Greater Seattle was born that day. And it was an extraordinary thing to hear exactly what they wanted to hear. The next day, Isaac Stevens assembled the Indians, Seattle, and his people on the beach in front of Doc Maynard's store to tell them what their future held. And basically he told them, well, you know, you're our children now, and we're going to take care of you, but you're going to give us your land. You'll have a little bit to live on, but the American government will take care of you. End of story. And so he said, and beware, you know, in a little bit, you're going to be called to treaty councils, and all this will be made plain unto you and on. And don't worry about it. And then he went on and gave other speeches to other groups. Well, these were the treaties that basically required the native people to give up almost all their land in exchange for, on northern Puget Sound, 4 small reservations of basically land that was marginal at best. And the idea was to move the Indians away from the Americans. Well, Seattle's idea was to blend the Indians and the Americans together to prosper. And the little town of Seattle was prospering to the degree that when war eventually came because of the treaties, and Yesler's mill was in operation, who ran the mill while the young white men were drilling in the militia? It was the Indians. The Indians ran the mill during the Indian War while the young white men were off fighting Indians. That's an extraordinary thing. It just shows you how successful that hybridization was working, but it was not to be. At the end of the Indian War and the ratification of the treaties, the Indians were driven out onto these distant reservations. And in 1865, when Seattle was given a charter by the territorial legislature, one of the first measures that it passed was a ban of Indian settlements in Seattle. The native people who had invited the Americans in and who had worked with them to create a vibrant community were driven out. And Seattle was one of these. And so in 1865, he's exiled to the west shore of Puget Sound to the Fort Madison Indian Reservation, where he dies in June of 1866. And it's no longer any news to the Americans, or at least the ones who publish the newspapers. So that's the story of Seattle I want to leave you with. He was a genuinely great man, and he was absolutely essential to the founding of the city of Seattle, the largest city in the world, named after a Native American. But his story was essentially forgotten. The great speech he gave when Governor Stevens announced to his people that the treaties were coming, in which Seattle was recorded to have given this marvelous oration, which was mostly the work of Henry Smith, a doctor who was a settler at the time. But Henry Smith was a prolific writer, and the speech was the greatest thing he ever wrote, which suggests to me he was dealing from a very powerful original. And he presents Seattle as as a defeated man passing the baton of history to the successful whites who, maybe in the future you will meet the same fate we are facing now. We may be brothers after all, but in the meantime, please be just and deal kindly with our people. Well, Seattle would have said nothing of the kind. His people were vital parts of the community he hoped to build. His first demand of the governor is, you will not deny us access to the graves of our ancestors. Many of those were within the town side of Seattle even then. So what we can take away, there's a kernel, I believe, and you have to read the book to find out where it is in the speech, but there's a kernel of authenticity in Henry Smith's speech, even though he overlays it with all this Victorian sentimentality. Which is to say that Seattle was such a profound orator, such a moving orator, that the messages he gave transcended translation. They could be communicated despite being translated from the native language down to a trade patois of probably no more than 300 words, and then from there to English. Despite that terrible disability, his message can be heard. At least I believe it can be heard. And so that is probably one of the greatest artifacts from Seattle's life. Unfortunately, the concern about the speech, was it really what Seattle said, has overshadowed the man. And it's taken 160 years for his life finally to be developed in the biography that I wrote. So I hope you will take a chance to read it and learn more about this most remarkable figure, not just in Seattle history, but Western history and American history. Well, thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
David, a couple of questions that have popped up, and Jim might have some help for you with this one.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the location of Fort Nisqually.
Hey, David, would you let me take this one, please?
Sure, go ahead.
I've shared it. And if people look on the right-hand page there, you see Anderson Island.
Mm-hmm.
And directly below Anderson Island is, and it's hard to read, is 11A. That's where Fort Nisqually is. And it's basically pretty close to where it is personally. It's located now in Point Defiance Park. If you go up to the right, there's a number 10. And when David talked about Fort Steilacoom, that's where Fort Steilacoom was located when they had their big trial.
That's
so
right.
There's the two of them.
Well, actually, there were several Fort Nisquallys, and about 3 years in, they rebuilt the fort about a mile inland. And I think I can't see the number there, but that's near there. And then it stayed there until the 1920s or 30s, I think, when it was essentially the one house that remained, the granary, was moved up to Point Defiance Park, and the rest of the structures were rebuilt around it from scratch. So it's a little bit disconcerting to find Fort Nisqually up at Point Defiance when it was down here, and this is where the Americans originally settled.
Okay, I'll stop that share.
Okay. Any other questions?
Only going back to the distinction between the spelling of his name and the pronunciation of his name.
Yeah.
And the I guess what I would call mixed use of his name between different locations. For example, his grave spells it as though it were the self.
Yeah, self, yes, S-E-A-L-T.
And in the quote from the speech, does he identify himself as
Yeah.
self?
Shaw, no, he says, I am Seattle. This is how Shaw writes it, Seattle.
And that's how the English writer wrote it.
Yeah. Of course, I've kept out the marker. Yeah, yes. So my name is Seattle, and I am, yeah. So that's how he writes it. At that time, well, once Seattle was founded as a town and its name was recorded, then the name became that of the chief. But again, native pronunciation, if you hear Lushootseed spoken, it is a most remarkable and exotic language filled with clicks and glottal stops and amazing sounds. And so it's very difficult for an American to pronounce. So when I said about the, voiceless lateral alveolar fricative, that is a very difficult sound for many Americans, most Americans to make, me included. I had to learn how to do that. So it's very difficult to pronounce his name as it was spoken. And there's slight variations, as I mentioned, too, over time. But basically, Siach is how you would pronounce his name amongst Native people.
Okay. Well, thank you, David, for a stimulating presentation. I think it's important to gain a new and enlarged perspective on something that we have known and been around and lived within for so long, and perhaps didn't really know a lot about.
That's right.
Because it was not truly in our history, and in the teaching that we learned.
Not at all. Yeah. And it's what's amazing is, Jesus only had to wait 30 years to have the first gospel printed. Seattle had to wait 160 years for his biography, which says a lot about something. I'm not quite sure, but nevertheless, it's significant.
Anyway, thank you so much for your presentation. And
Thank
I'd
you.
also like to thank Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau, Tara Teitzel of WSSRA for all of her help in setting up the webinar and the technical assistance that she offered us, and Jim Sissel for managing the images today that were shown. And thank you to all of you who participated